Inside the cranial vault, we find a core organ of the central nervous system, and arguably the most vital organ of the human body, that is our brain. With a volume of 1,060 centimeters cubed, a surface area of 2,200 centimeters squared, and a weight of 1.5 kilograms, the left and right cerebral hemispheres contain over 86 billion neurons. This equates to the number of stars in the Milky Way. Hello, my name is Dr. Nikki, and together we are going to explore the cerebral hemispheres, the lobes, as well as the functional cortical areas. The outer 1 to 5 millimeters of the cerebral cortex, this is the part made up of the grey matter or the cell body of our neurons, is going to be the focus of this lightboard video. The functions of the cerebrum are truly fascinating. They work every day to keep us alive, to ensure that our organs are working properly as they respond to our external environment, to help us to carry out everyday tasks. The cerebrum is also responsible for our personalities, our behavior, our feelings and our emotion. It also houses our memories. It is responsible for our unique quirks, our special talents, and our imagination. To me, the structure of the cranium is analogous with that of a walnut. So once you crack through that hard outer shell, or in our cases, the skull, we then unveil two cerebral hemispheres, which, as we know, consist of a series of folds and grooves to help to tuck it into that cranial vault. If we had to stretch out all of our folds, this would actually equate to over 1 square meter in length. So with respect to terminology, each of the elevations or folds are then referred to as our gyri. Meanwhile, the grooves in between are referred to as our sulci. Thinking about the functional design of the cerebral hemispheres, one way in which we can increase cognitive capacity, as well as reduce the neural space required, is to avoid duplication of functions on the left and right sides of the brain. To achieve this, asymmetry or lateralisation of function is seen, where the left and right sides of the cerebral hemispheres have distinct functions. This is also a protective mechanism in case there is injury or damage to one side of the brain. One of the most obvious signs of this asymmetry refers to the near universal dominance of individuals being right-handed. Because the left hemisphere of the brain also controls the dominant right hand and side, it has become widely regarded as the dominant hemisphere. Accordingly, the right cerebral hemisphere in majority of the population is then referred to as the non-dominant hemisphere. If we're then thinking about the functions of our individual cerebral hemispheres, we typically say that the dominant hemisphere, that is, the left hemisphere in 75 to 90% of the population, is responsible for controlling our speech and language centers. In addition, this side is responsible for reading, writing, arithmetic, so mathematical functions, as well as voluntary movement of the contralateral side. The non-dominant hemisphere, on the other hand, so the right cerebral hemisphere, specialized for the emotional tone of language, music, creativity, and big concepts. It also contains important areas that are responsible for non-linguistic functions. This includes complex pattern recognition, vision, audition, tactile senses, as well as the sense of intuition. From here, we can then isolate some of these functions even further by dividing each cerebral hemisphere into cerebral lobes. on the superior view, so looking down on the brain, we can locate the central sulcus. We can see that it's coursing from the medial edge of that longitudinal fissure, and it's then going to course anteriorly and laterally to intersect another sulcus or fissure known as the lateral fissure that we'll see in a different view in a minute. So the central sulcus is really important because it helps us to divide the two largest lobes of the brain. So all of the brain tissue then rostral, so in front of or anterior to the central sulcus, then represents the frontal lobe. Behind this then, or caudally, we then have our parietal lobes. You will notice too that both the frontal and the parietal are considered to be paired lobes. So on this view, towards the posterior side of our image, we then find the parieto-occipital sulcus. And this is going to help us to demarcate the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. The final lobe that we then need to consider is going to be the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is actually hidden on this superior view because it's going to be located beneath the parietal lobe. It is roughly located in this area. On the lateral view, in this case we're looking at the left cerebral hemisphere, let's try to identify the central and the parieto-occipital sulcus. Additionally, on this view, we can also then see our lateral fissure. And this is going to be that really deep sulcus that helps us to separate the temporal lobe from the adjacent lobes. There is a final almost pseudo-sulcus that's important to help us to demarcate or determine the boundaries between the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. Towards the anterior part of the occipital lobe, on that inferior surface, we see what is referred to as the pre-occipital notch. And this can roughly be used then to separate or to find the temporal lobe. If we look at the organization of the brain parenchyma, we typically say that the anterior third of the brain is going to be responsible for our movement, that is our motor output. All sensory information then, on the other hand, is going to be received and processed by the posterior parts of the brain. If we turn our attention then to what is going to be the largest lobe of the brain, this is going to be located anterior or in front of that central sulcus, and it is going to occupy roughly a third of the brain parenchyma and the cerebral cortex. And this is going to be the frontal lobe. This lobe is primarily concerned with voluntary movements of the body. Other major functions will also include motor planning and the execution or the initiation of movement. This includes the initiation of speech as well from the dominant hemispheres, so the left hemisphere. The frontal lobe is also responsible for our executive function, that is, our judgment, our decision making, our critical thinking, our intelligence, and our abstract thinking. It is also going to be involved in learning, in problem solving, in planning, as well as personality and behavior. Posterior then to the central sulcus, but anterior to that parieto-occipital sulcus, we then have our parietal lobe. This lobe is going to be responsible for controlling our perception and sensation. It is going to house the primary somatosensory cortex, which is the first area of the cortex that is going to receive incoming sensory information from external stimuli. This is going to include temperature, pressure, pain, texture, shape and size, as well as weight, or internal stimuli from our organs or from our tissues that relate to proprioception. If there is a lesion or damage to the parietal lobe in the dominant hemisphere, that is the left parietal lobe, an individual will present with agraphia, finger agnosia, as well as left-right orientation. This is consistent and characteristic of what we refer to then of Gerstmann syndrome. If there is damage to the non-dominant hemisphere, the patient will present with agnosia of the contralateral side of the world. This is referred to then as hemispatial neglect syndrome. This means that there will be a preference or dominance to only see one half of the world. So in this particular case, since it's affecting the non-dominant hemisphere, perception of the left side of the world is then going to be impaired. Posterior to the parieto-occipital sulcus, we then have the occipital lobe. As you can see, this is going to be superior to the cerebellum and the tentorium cerebelli, which is that dural fold that separates the two organs. The occipital lobe is the visual processing area of the brain. It is going to be where all of our special sensory stimuli from our eyes are going to then send the information to then become interpreted and to make meaning of this stimuli. It is associated with visuospatial processing. It is going to help us to determine distance and depth. It is also responsible for color determination as well as recognition of objects and faces. All of our other senses then are going to then be located or processed within the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is kind of cool in the fact that only primates contain and have a temporal lobe. It is going to be fairly big in the sense that it comprises of 17% of the cerebral cortex. And as we can see, it is located inferior to the lateral fissure. It is going to be anterior to that preoccipital notch, and it contains its own temporal pole. The Human Connectome project divided the temporal lobe into 4 main parts based on its function. Firstly, if we consider the lateral surfaces of the temporal lobe, these are responsible for semantic processing. This is also going to be responsible for hearing. So in this area, we find our acoustic sound processing areas located in the superior temporal gyrus, usually in the dominant or the left hemisphere. We also find centers responsible for speech production and comprehension. In the polar aspects of the temporal lobe, that is the front and inferior surfaces, we then see certain functions relating to emotional processing. This includes things like picking up social cues, emotions, or the recognition of faces on the non-dominant hemisphere. In the inferior parts of the temporal lobe, we then find our visual processing centers. This also includes areas responsible for our working memory, and specifically we have a strip of gyrus that is called the fusiform gyrus that is really important in reading, object and facial recognition. And then finally, the medial surfaces that we cannot see from this view are going to play a role in memory and visuospatial processing. Here we also find structures of the limbic system, such as the hippocampus and the amygdala. We also find the olfactory cortex on the medial side of the temporal lobe. Therefore, damage to these surfaces are typically associated with PTSD, Alzheimer's disease, and temporal lobe epilepsy. Coming back to that concept of asymmetry, it is actually quite apparent in the temporal lobe, with the left side playing roles in the recall or the identification of verbal and visual stimuli, Meanwhile, the right side, or the non-dominant side, is going to be involved in the recognition of tones, music, and the identification or recall of faces. So I hope that gives you a brief overview of the function and the arrangement of the cerebral hemispheres, how we can then isolate functions into specific cerebral lobes, keeping in mind that there are 4 main lobes that we can see of the brain parenchyma, and we've gone through how we can then separate these lobes on the basis of important sulci. Thank you for watching this video, and please make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel and check out some other lightboard videos that aim to break down complex neuroscience and neuroanatomy concepts in an easy manner using a drawing to learn approach.